Well, good morning. About time to begin our Bible class hour this morning. Before we begin this morning, let's start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for this day and for all the blessings of it, Father, all the blessings you've given us. And thank you for this Lord's Day and opportunity we have to assemble together this morning and be able to worship you here shortly, Father. Pray for this Bible class hour and the time we can spend together and study your word, Father, learn more about your word and what our duties are to you. And pray we'll always be good stewards of your word. Pray as we study this morning, we'll study with open minds and open hearts. And pray that we can better understand those things, Father, that we should do to live in accordance to your will. Pray for your forgiveness for any sins that miss our life. Help us to always live in accordance to your will. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to continue our study in Matthew chapter 22. I had some kind of technical issue with my slides, so my slides, we won't have any slides this morning. Somehow or another, they got corrupted on my flash drive or something, so it's showing that I have nothing there. So we'll get through this morning without any slides. But so we're going to pick up in Matthew chapter 22, verse number 15. So last week we ended with verse number 14. Including the marriage dinner, and then we talked about the wedding garment, the guests that didn't have a wedding garment. So we finished the marriage dinner parable. We'll go into what's considered the question of the tribute money to Caesar. So the remainder of Matthew chapter 22, from here through verse 46, covers events that are directly after Jesus teaches the three parables. So this is him in the temple. He taught the three parables, the parables of the two sons, the parable of the husbandman, and the parable of the marriage dinner. And then after this, he's approached by three different groups or individuals, and he's asked three questions. So each group or individual asks one question, and then Jesus responds to all of those questions with a question of his own. So that's the sort of an overview of the remainder of Matthew chapter 22. So we'll be looking at these questions, these four questions, three questions posed to Jesus, and then one question posed by Jesus to the people that would question him, or in front of this multitude, for example. So the first one is the tribute money to Caesar, starting in verse number 15. I think it's interesting to note that David Daub, in his work, The New Testament and Rabbinic Judaism, noted that there was a similarity between these four questions and then what is considered the four types of rabbinical inquiry, which would be, the rabbis from the religion of Judaism, the rabbis being the teachers there. Apparently, recorded in the Babylonian Talmud, it was posed by the Alexandrians to the Jewish teacher Joshua ben Hanani in the 2nd century. They come up with four types of rabbinic inquiry. These four types were questions regarding the law, questions aimed at mocking the beliefs of the one being questioned, questions regarding moral principles of life, and then questions regarding the resolution of perceived contradictions in Scripture. So David Daub noted the similarity between these four questions of what's considered rabbinic inquiry and then the four questions here in Matthew chapter 22. We can see the similarities there. There's, as far as the types, those types of questions, each one of these questions sort of falls into one of those general categories. So let's pick up in Matthew chapter 22, verse number 15. We'll read through verse 22. Then went the Pharisees and took counsel how they might entangle him in his talk. They sent out unto him their disciples with Herodians, saying, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, but thou regardest not the person of men. Tell us therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? But Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, Why tempt ye me, you hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. And they brought unto him a penny. And he saith unto them, Who is this image and superscription? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. And when they had heard these words, they marveled and left him and went their way. So Matthew specifies immediately what the intentions were of the Pharisees in the group that came to Jesus. He makes it clear that their intention was to entangle Jesus in. He makes it clear that their intention was to entangle Jesus in his talk. So the word entangle there means ensnare, entrap, and it's generally used of like the trapping of birds, for example, birds or animals. It also means of the attempt to elicit from one some remark which can be turned into an accusation against him. So their motives were clearly to try to pose a question to Jesus so that they could catch him in some trap per se, and then eventually, as we'll see, they'll either turn him. Their goal was to either turn him over to the authorities for punishment or execution, or at least to discredit him amongst the other Jews. So Luke gives a little bit more detail of this in Luke chapter 20. Look at Luke chapter 20, verses 19 and 20. It says, And the chief priests and the scribes the same hour sought to lay hands on him, and they feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. So this is after. So again, Luke doesn't record the parable of the marriage dinner. His account stops with the parable of the husbandman. So this is after the parable of the husbandman. The chief priests and scribes perceived that Jesus was talking about them, and then that same hour they go out to begin plotting his death. They wanted to kill him right then, but it says they feared the people. Verse 20, And they watched him and sent forth spies, which should feign themselves just men, that they might take hold of his words, that so they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor. So we see a few things that we can note about the passage here in Luke. First, we see that this is another coordinated attack against Jesus. Remember back when Jesus first came to the temple, back in Matthew 21, the chief priests and scribes and the elders sent to him representatives of each one of those groups question his authority. So there was a coordinated attack against Jesus, question his authority. This is another coordinated attack against Jesus. Second, we can see that the Jewish leaders, it mentions the chief priests and the scribes here, the Jewish leaders are the ones that coordinated this attack as well. They coordinated the last attack against Jesus, now they're coordinating another attack. Third, we can see that it is their anger in response to Jesus' parables against them that they coordinated this attack to begin with. So verse 19 says that they perceived that he had spoken this parable against him. So in their anger, instead of listening to Jesus' words and hearing what he's teaching, instead they responded with anger and violence, and had decided that at that point to kill him. And says the same hour sought to lay hands on him. So if they thought they could have killed him at that exact time and got away with it, they would have. But they feared the people, because the people saw Jesus as a prophet, and they were afraid of the repercussions of that. So instead, they tried to coordinate these attacks and come up with this plot to kill Jesus. So finally, we can see that they wanted to outright kill him. That was their desire. So the point of this coordinated attack was that if they could entangle him in his words, then they could deliver him over into the powers. Luke says that in verse number 20. So they might deliver him unto the power and authority of the governor. So if they could entangle him in his words, sort of try to entrap Jesus in some scenario, then they could report this to the governor, to the Roman authorities, and have him killed. And then they would have been able to execute their plan without making the people mad, because now the Jewish leaders hadn't killed Jesus; it was the Roman government that had killed Jesus. So Luke mentions that, and they watched him and sent forth spies which should feign themselves just men. So the word feign here means to simulate or pretend, to impersonate anyone, play a part. And the phrase just men means in a wide sense, upright, righteous, virtuous, keeping the commandments of God. So the chief priests and the scribes and the elders sent these groups of people to Jesus that were acting like they were righteous men. So they were playing the part of a righteous man to come to Jesus to ask what they were trying to imply would have been a sincere question. So to me, the irony in that whole thought is outrageous. You have the leaders of the nation of Israel. These are the leaders of the nation of God, who themselves should be just men. They should be righteous and virtuous and keeping the commands of God. But instead, they're not. They're trying to kill the Son of God. But it's a very great, it's outrageous irony to me that the leaders of the nation of God are sending people to fake righteousness so that they could question the Son of God and try to entrap Him in His word so that they could have Him killed. I mean, you're talking about people that should be virtuous and should be righteous and should be keeping the commands of God to begin with, but instead they put on this persona of somebody that's doing this and go and try to entangle the person that's living the perfect life, the person that is keeping the commands of God, who happens to be the Son of God, so that they can kill Him in the process. So the irony in that is just outrageous to me, that just that whole scenario, what they're doing, Absolutely, yeah. In the very definition of the word. I mean, Jesus calls them hypocrites in Matthew 22, verse. Let me get back here. Verse 18. He calls them hypocrites, and that's what's funny, because the word hypocrite means an actor, a stage player, or a pretender. That's exactly what the people were doing. They were pretending to be righteous, pretending to be just men. All part of this plot to entangle Jesus in His words. So again, the irony there is outrageous and just sad, in my opinion. I mean, look at what they're doing.
They would not be for someone under Caesar's direct command or under that authority, that Roman government. They would not be in favor of them. They didn't like all the taxes that they imposed on them, all things.
Yeah.
But now, who they have with them? They have the Herodians. They have those people that were in favor of the Jewish people, that were in favor of that Roman control, paying that Roman tax and all that. So they got those people there listed, looking for any little bitty thing that they can try to.
Absolutely.
But under normal circumstances, they would not want anything to do with those people because they didn't agree with that Roman control.
Right. Well, there's a lot of, you think about that, there's an uneasy alliance here with the Herodians, but also the people that are supposed to be just. These people are faking, pretending to be just, pretending to be virtuous. They have no problem with outright lying, being deceitful. They have no problem with killing an innocent man, right? There's nothing that Jesus has done per se that's, hey, this was wrong, He needs to be punished for this. They just didn't like Him. They didn't like what He was saying. They didn't like what He was teaching. And it was, what can we do to wrap this around some kind of justifiable legal response to kill Him, right? Yes. Yes. That's true, yeah. That's right, yeah. Right, yeah. Well, so when it was all said and done, the Romans said, well, we don't see nothing wrong here anyway, right? So, yeah. That's a good point, Roger. Brother Ed, you have a comment?
Well, on what has been said, I was just going to say that what they're trying to do, Jesus is exercising His authority. He's already cleansed the temple and so forth. And they're trying to pit Him against what's already been said, the Romans. They're pit him against the Roman rule.
Right.
Because the Jews are under the Roman rule. And they got to play this thing very tactfully right here. And so limit as to where they would go to try to find fault with Jesus in order. They do that, then they're really pleasing their leaders.
Right.
Emperor's rule.
Yeah.
They're under their rule. So they knew the prophets. They had the prophets. So if they follow Jesus and their prophets, then that's going to put them in a dilemma between Christ and the Roman rule.
Yep.
They're going to be trapped right in the middle.
Yep.
So they're trying to wiggle their way out of this thing, and the only way they can do it is to get rid of the man that's they're pitting against the Roman rule.
Right. That's right. Hey, you can see their dilemma is that they want to maintain their status and their status with the people. They don't want to just outright kill Jesus because they know if they just killed him right here that the people are not going to like that because the multitude of people are following him. But so you can definitely, I think, see this intimidation factor where they tried to intimidate Jesus by bringing the Herodians here like this is these are representatives or those that support the Roman government. I would think hoping that there would be some intimidation there, that maybe he would be afraid to speak against tribute to Caesar or something along those lines. There's a lot of aspects of that, but
they don't want to go against Roman rule at this particular time.
Yeah.
Right now.
Right. And
this is their way out.
Right. In a few years they will. Like it was mentioned, they didn't like the paying tribute to Caesar, but they sort of reluctantly, did it at this time. But
I've read some stuff in secular history that, Caesar at this time, I can't say his name Tiberius, I think.
It's Tiberius, yeah.
He oddly was in favor of some of the teachings of Christianity in that movement. And so I think that, just by secular history alone, that they didn't want to revolt. And Herod and all those didn't want to support that because then Caesar would come down on them. He kind of, some things I read in secular history kind of give that idea that may be into play here too, as far as if they don't want to pay tribute,
yeah.
But then they don't want to revolt and have anything.
Yeah.
That Roman government would just completely annihilate them. Look in 70, look ahead, 70.
They did. They did.
What happened? So there's several things in play here, and they're trying their best to be as slick and sly as they can, and try to find something out of that this man has that they can find fault with.
Yeah.
And they can't do it. They never can do it.
Yeah, there's definitely they've definitely been at they've definitely been at odds with the Roman government and the tributes and all this stuff, because actually my understanding is one of the reasons that Herod invested a significant amount of money in the second temple. So when the Jews rebuilt the second temple, it was nowhere near as magnificent as Solomon's temple, right? So it was been a much more modest structure. And then Herod remodels the temple there and spends a large sum of money over several years remodeling the temple, making it, some people say, more magnificent than what Solomon's temple was. But apparently his whole purpose of doing that was to appease the Jews, right? And 46 years to remodel it. I mean, that's a long time. And I forgot but there was a significant amount of money, a long period of time to rebuild, to remodel the temple. So, and his whole purpose of doing that was to appease the Jews. So there was an uneasy alliance, I guess you could say there, where they didn't like paying tribute to Caesar, but they sort of did. And that's where the basis of this whole question comes from. They think that this is a hot topic. This is a slippery topic to talk about. It'd be, you think about some political issues, political topics today, it'd be us, you could go up to somebody and you almost know, depending on what somebody says or how you know they think, you can light a fire under them by asking them the right question or making the right statement. So that was the whole purpose here. The whole purpose was for them to catch Jesus, saying something wrong so that they could have him killed. So the Sanhedrin, the chief priests, scribes, and elders are the ones that organized this attack. And as we mentioned, we see them elicit some assistance of, we might say they're allies in this matter. They might be uneasy allies. But notice in Matthew 22, verse 15, it talks about the Pharisees and it says they took counsel. When it says they took counsel, it shows this attack was deliberate and planned, right? They had sat down and planned something about what they were planning to do. So we see in Matthew's account here, verse number 15 going into 16, we see the Pharisees join forces with the Herodians. So this is the first attempt here to entangle Jesus. So who were the Herodians? Well, the name Herod, I know most of us have probably heard of King Herod or Herod the Great. His name is mentioned several times throughout the New Testament. So the name Herod had become the name of a dynasty of leaders, much like Caesar did in the Roman Empire. So if somebody says Caesar, it could be a whole series of a number of different Caesars, but Caesar is the title that was worn by the emperor in power at the time, and the name Herod became something similar to that. So Herod was a dynasty of rulers, and it could have been a number of Herods that were in power. So not a lot is known exactly about the Herodians, who exactly they were. Some say that they would have been servants, courtiers, or officials of Herod Antipas. Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, he used a similar term to refer to the soldiers of Herod the Great. And then Thayer defines the Herodians as Herod's partisans. So who exactly the Herodians were, maybe it's up for a little bit of debate, but I think we can see for sure from the context of the passage here and the name that they carry. I mean, we carry the name Christians because we follow Christ. Obviously, you would think that the Herodians would be somebody that followed Herod or supported Herod. So I think for the purpose of our study, and then from the context here, we can see that with this interaction with Jesus and then their alliance, they're taking counsel with the Pharisees, we can assume that the Herodians would have been supporters of Herod and then the rule of that royal family. I mean, we can at least say that for sure. We've got two sides. You've got the Pharisees who would represent the religious side, and you've got the Herodians who would represent the political or governmental side. And both of them are coming together to ask Jesus this question. Also notice in verse number 16, when they sent out their disciples with Herodians, saying, Master, we know that thou art true, and teachest the way of God in truth. Neither carest thou for any man, for thou regardest not the person of men. So they approached Jesus with a lot of flattery. They're calling him master or teacher. They're telling him that we know that you're true. Your teachings are true. You're from God. So they approached Jesus with flattering words, and this is all under a false pretense because they don't actually believe that Jesus is true. But they're trying to tell him words that they think that he might want to hear, so that they can sort of butter him up a little bit. And now maybe he lets his defenses down a little bit, so when they ask him a question, they can trap him. The whole purpose was to trap him. When they say that he carest not for any man, and then again, thou regardest not the person of man. So what he's saying is that they're saying Jesus doesn't have any favoritism toward men. He's not a respecter of persons. He doesn't care about outward appearance or anything of that nature. That Jesus is just and righteous, in his teachings and in his judgment. But apparently they thought that this false praise and all these deceitful words would carry some weight with Jesus, and that maybe he would lower his defenses, and that would help him entrap him, entangle him in some of his words. But so the Herodian family would have been heavily dependent upon Rome for its position. We mentioned this a little bit. So this whole area was under Roman rule, and King Herod would have been the local. He wasn't always called the king, but he would have been the local governor, I guess you would call him, from the Roman. He was under the Roman Roman rule, but he was the local leader, I guess you could say, under the Roman rule there. So they would have been heavily dependent upon Rome for his position and his power. So it seems that the purpose of this alliance, with the Pharisees and the Herodians, was to trap Jesus in either his allegiance to his religion or his allegiance to his government. And this all that we've talked about this morning, we see kind of how that kind of fits together. That the whole purpose was they've got two sides of the same coin, and they think that they've got the perfect situation where Jesus won't have any choice other than to choose either his religion or his government. And they think if he chooses either one of them, they got him trapped. If he chooses his religion, then if he says, well, it's not lawful because they ask him, is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar, verse number 17. So if he says it's not lawful to give tribute unto Caesar, well, now they've got him trapped on the government side. So now they can turn him over to the authorities for treason, saying, hey, this man is teaching that it's not lawful to give tribute unto Caesar. But then on the other side, if he says that it is lawful to give tribute unto Caesar, then they think that they've got him trapped on his religious allegiance, because now those people that are following him will not follow him because he's given allegiance to Caesar and not God. So we've already mentioned that the Jews had a disdain for paying tribute to the Roman government. They really didn't like it. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 17, Deuteronomy 17 verses 14 and 15. This is so Moses has given the children of Israel these commands from God, and then this is regarding the choice of a king here in verse number 14. When thou art come unto the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee, and shalt possess it, and shalt dwell therein, and shalt say, I will set a king over me, like as all the nations that are about me. Thou shalt in any wise set him king over thee, whom the Lord thy God shall choose. One from among thy brethren shalt thou set over thee. Thou mayest not set a stranger over thee, which is not thy brother. So, God's command for a king was that the king had to come within the nation of Israel. So, the Jews saw paying tribute to foreign kings the same as having a king ruling over them as God's people. So that was one of the reasons that they didn't like paying tribute to foreign nations, was the fact that they saw that as disobedience to God's will. But yeah, what do you think about this? Yeah, what's your opinion? Yeah. 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 Right. That's true. That's a good point. They definitely didn't care about, this wasn't a sincere effort, so they didn't care, what was right and what was wrong. So maybe that was part of it. Just if I can get your opinion, hey, it's just between me and you. We're just two people talking. What do you think about it? Sort of thing, maybe. So if we go back to Matthew chapter 22, so Deuteronomy, we see that God lays out the rules for those that are going to be ruling over Israel, and though the Jews saw this as paying tribute as the same as having a foreign king over them. So that's one of the reasons they didn't like paying tribute to Caesar. But they thought, so all this together, you can see that the Jews, the Pharisees, Herodians, thought they had Jesus in a situation that he couldn't get out of. If he chooses one side or the other, they've got him trapped, at least so they thought.
Think about this, too, add to that. They don't understand that Christ is not here to set up a physical kingdom.
Right, exactly.
It's spiritual. And so they think that there's no answer to this question that he can make that's going to be right.
Exactly.
They don't understand where he's coming from.
Yep.
And they won't for a long So if he says, render to Caesar what's Caesar's and render to God what's God, that's not even an extra choice that was on that they could pick from.
Well, they didn't anticipate that.
Yeah, right. So it's just, he's so far ahead in thinking than they would ever be. And they're just left dumbfounded. They don't know what to say.
Right.
Their plot is just blows up in their face.
Well, like you said, they thought it was a physical kingdom, and that was one of the reasons I think that back in Matthew 21 that the leaders took it so offensively what he had said, because he told them that the kingdom's going to be taken away from you and given to somebody else. And they think all this is physical. I'm going to lose my place. I'm going to lose my position and all this sort of stuff. So they think that when they say pay it to Caesar, if you don't pay it to Caesar, that well, you need to pay it to my physical kingdom or something along those lines. It was all physical, but so it wasn't even, Jesus' answer wasn't even on their radar. They thought they had the perfect situation where they could trap him, but obviously they didn't. So the Jews had paid tribute to several kings throughout their history, or several other nations. In 2 Kings chapter 23, verse number 33, it says, and Pharaoh Necho put him in bands at Riblah in the hand of Hamath, that he might not reign in Jerusalem. He put the land to a tribute of 100 talents of silver and a talent of gold. And then in Esther chapter 10, verse 1, and the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. So this is just two examples of Israel paying tribute to foreign kings. So they had paid tribute to foreign kings in the past. Based on this, I guess it doesn't appear so much that God equated the two matters as being equal, as far as having a foreign king over you and then paying tribute to a foreign king, or at least it was something that was done. At least it appears that paying tribute to a foreign king was not the same as having a foreign king rule over you, or having a Gentile king rule over you. So, the point of this was, the point of the question here that they're asking Jesus was not to sincerely determine, is it right to pay tribute to a foreign king when this foreign king is not necessarily the ruler, because the Jews were still able to run their nation as the nation of God. They were still able to have their practices, their customs, and all this. Which, as we move forward in our lesson, we'll see that, or in our study, Matthew 24, that was actually not common in the Roman government. It wasn't common for them to be able to function with that level of autonomy. But the Jewish nation was actually allowed to function with a level of autonomy that was not common with the Roman government, with the Roman province. This was a Roman province that was governed lightly, we might say, and that they still had their Jewish laws and their customs and their rules and everything that was followed. You see that when Jesus stands before Pilate. He said, well, the Roman government hasn't seen anything against him, but they said, well, he's broken our rules. He's broken our rules, not necessarily the Roman government rules. But so the purpose of this question is not, they don't care about the right interpretation of the Scripture. They just want to ensnare Jesus in his talk. Verse number 18, but Jesus perceived their wickedness and said, why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? I think it's interesting that we can make, or there's an interesting contrast that we can make here for the word perceived between here and Matthew 22, verse 18, and then again in Luke chapter 20, in verse 19. So in Luke 20, verse 19, it says, and the chief priests and the scribes the same hour sought to lay hands on him. They feared the people, for they perceived that he had spoken this parable against them. And in Matthew 22, 18, it says, Jesus perceived their wickedness and asked, why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? So we can see an interesting contrast here with the word perceived. Matthew 22, 18, it's used, or first Luke chapter 20, verse 19, we see that it's used in the sense of an unrepentant sinner who is faced with a righteous judgment. He perceives this judgment that's being put on him, but instead of being convicted of his sins, he responds violently. But Luke 20, verse 19, the word perceived is used for an unrepentant sinner who's faced with a righteous judgment. In Matthew chapter 22, verse 18, we see the word perceive used with a righteous judge who's faced with an unrepentant sinner. I think it's an interesting contrast here we can see between what's being perceived. The chief priests and elders perceive that they're being told what they're doing is not right. They didn't like that. Jesus perceives that these people are being dishonest. He perceives the sinfulness in their heart. We know that we don't have to read the verses, but there's several verses: Matthew 9, verse 4, Matthew 12, 25, and Luke 6 and 8. That tell us that Jesus knows the hearts of these people. There are several instances where Jesus knows the hearts of those around him. He can see their hearts, and he can see the hearts of the Pharisees and Herodians here. So he saw through their facade immediately, right? There was no tricking Jesus in this matter. He knew that this is all under false pretense, that they're using flattery and deceitful words and hypocritical actions in order to try to entrap him in his talk. So, Jesus saw through this from the beginning. Also, it's interesting to me that in Luke says that Jesus perceived their craftiness. If you go back to Luke chapter 20, Luke's account, in verse number 23, it says, "But he perceived their craftiness and said unto them, Why tempt ye me?" Again, we can make a interesting contrast on the word craftiness. If you go to 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 3, it says, "But I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your mind should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ." So the word subtlety here used in 2 Corinthians 11 verse 3 is the same Greek word that's used for craftiness in Luke 20 verse 23. So just as the serpent used his craftiness to deceive Eve in the Garden of Eden regarding the fruit, the Pharisees, Herodians, are trying to be crafty to deceive Jesus here in the temple around his craftiness. So we can see that the exact same attitude, the exact same intention that Satan had in the garden is what the Pharisees and the Herodians have here to the Son of God. Verses 19 to 20, Jesus says, "Show me the tribute money." And they brought unto him a penny. And he saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? So this, when Jesus says it says they brought him a penny, this wouldn't have been a penny, what we call a penny today. Our penny is a 1/100th of a dollar. This would have been most likely a denarius, which was a Roman silver coin. It's commonly agreed that the 1 denarius was valued at the daily wage of a soldier or a manual laborer. From the Bible Almanac, it says the Roman denarius was the most common used during Jesus' day. Struck from silver, this coin bore an imprint with the head of the emperor. The denarius bore the profile Tiberius Caesar of the divine Augustus. So I guess sort of like we've got something like In God We Trust in our coinage, they had an inscription on their coinage, Tiberius Caesar of the divine Augustus. The Romans historically treated deceased ancestors as gods and prayed and worshiped them. This also applied to deceased emperors, and then eventually led into emperor worship while they were still living. Because of this, the Jewish people were not allowed to use coins as offerings in religious services. They converted their coins to pieces of silver. So since it had the image of Caesar and had this inscription, Tiberius Caesar of the divine Augustus, the Jewish saw this as idolatrous, and of course they viewed the Roman nation in general as idolatrous and blasphemous. So they refused to use this coinage in any sort of payment to religious services. Instead, they would have this Roman coinage converted over to pieces of silver, and this is what they would use for religious services. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and you can imagine that was, I mean, if you can generate a job for yourself by saying, hey, we don't need to use these coins, give it to me, and by the way, I'll get a cut of when I convert your money over. But yeah, that was a job for the money changers. So But you can see the intent here of this question is that this coinage or this coinage by itself is inherently evil, I guess, because it represents the Roman government. But the Jews, however, did use the Roman coinage in their daily transactions. So if they go to the market to buy food or buy something, then they use the Roman coins. So Jesus' response to their question here is when he says, "Whose inscription is this?" What he's really getting at is that this coin belongs to Caesar. It was authorized, issued, and accepted in his government, and by using it, they all implicitly accepted that Caesar was their ruler. Verse number 21, they say unto him, "Caesar," this is Caesar's image and subscription. Then saith he unto them, "Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things which are God's." So I think Jesus' response highlighted how the question was somewhat out of context in regards to whether paying the taxes was lawful or not. Instead, it was important to understand that the role of civil governments in general is part of God's plan, and that the duties that His people have while we're citizens are under them, we have a duty to submit to those civil governments. So that the idea central to this question was: is the government evil or not? Is it evil to pay tribute to the government because the government is evil? This is basically the intention there of the question. But we could say that was really taken out of context. That was the wrong question to ask to begin with, because civil governments are part of God's plan. In John chapter 19, verse 11, Jesus answered, "Thou couldst have no power at all against me, except it were given thee from above. Therefore he that delivered me unto thee hath the greater sin." This is Jesus when he's standing before Pilate. And he tells Pilate that, if you go back to verse number 10 there, "Then saith Pilate unto him, Speakest thou not unto me? Knowest thou not that I have power to crucify thee and have power to release thee?" And Jesus' response is, "The only power that you have was power that was given to you." So he recognizes, he's telling Pilate here that civil government, the power of the civil government, comes from God. Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. For rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? Do that which is good, and thou shalt have praise of the same. For he is the minister of God to thee for good. But if thou do that which is evil, be afraid, for he beareth not the sword in vain. For he is the minister of God, a revenger, to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. Wherefore ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, but also for conscience sake. For this cause pay ye tribute also, for they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render therefore to all their dues, tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom is due, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." And in 1 Peter chapter 2, First Peter 2, beginning in verse number 13, "Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers, and for the praise of them that do well. For so is the will of God, that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king." So we see that really the point that Jesus is making is that civil governments, it says, render unto Caesar that is Caesar's, render unto God what is God's. So the whole aspect, the whole point of civil governments is an institution that's ordained of God, with the purpose being that we as Christians and we as citizens under those nations, we submit to the rule of the government, because it's really for the betterment, it's for our own good, right? It's saying, these passages we just read, that The whole purpose of the government is to punish the evildoers. So if you're a Christian, you're doing what's right, it shouldn't be doing you any harm to submit to the civil government, because you should be following those laws. But also, you make the point that the denarius here was made with the image of Caesar. So you got a coin here that bears the image of a man, representing the civil government. So tribute from this piece bearing his image is paid to the man that bears his image. Man is made in the image of God. So our tribute is made, when we talk about render to God what is God's, then we're made in the image of God. Our soul is made in the image of God. So the tribute that we pay to God is not physical, which we know that our contributions every Lord's Day is something that we do as Christians. It's because it takes a certain amount of worldly money to do the work of the church, right? I think we all understand that. When we talk to paying tribute to someone, we pay tribute to Caesar. What is Caesar's by the thing that bears his image. We pay tribute to God by giving the thing that bears his image, which is our soul. And then
Paul said in Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, that you present your bodies as living sacrifice.
Absolutely.
That's our contribution.
Absolutely. And then a little bit later in this chapter, we'll look at, Jesus says, when he's asked what's the greatest commandment, love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy mind. That's the living sacrifice you're talking about. So that's the contrast we can make here, that our soul has the image of God on it, just like this coin has the image of Caesar. So that's the tribute we pay, giving ourselves, giving our soul and our life as a living sacrifice to God. So we see here in verse number 22, when they heard these things, they marveled, and they left him, went their way. So Jesus' response wasn't even on their radar. They thought they had the perfect opportunity. They could trap him in his words. They thought regardless of if he chooses this way or this way, we've got him, one way or the other. But Jesus responds in a way that they had no idea, they didn't anticipate, and really just completely dumbfounded them, so much so that they marveled and they just walked away.
Whether they meant it or not, back in verse 16, they already said, we know you speak with what's true.
Right, yeah.
Well, it comes out right here. He spoke what's true.
He spoke what was true. Yeah.
They couldn't handle that.
That's true. That's right, yeah. Yeah. Right, yeah. They took counsel. I guess I wonder how long it took them to come up with this question, for one, and it took them for, they put their heads together, come up with this quote unquote perfect scenario, and Jesus answered them right off, so much so that they didn't have a response, But just to say, I think that this goes how they marveled and how they left him. They didn't know what to say. This goes right along with the irony and hypocrisy of this event. When you see Jesus standing before Pilate, in Luke chapter 23, this will be the last verse we look at. Luke chapter 23, verses 1 and 2. And the whole multitude of them arose and led him unto Pilate, and when they began to accuse him, saying, we found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar, saying that he is himself is Christ the King. And knowing good and well that Jesus did not say don't give tribute to Caesar. But I think it fits perfectly well with the irony and the hypocrisy of this whole event, that later on down the road they would take what he said and just ignore it, and then did what they want to do with it anyway. So, all right, thank y'all.